Miran, Dritan, and Arben weren't just teenagers. They were the faces of a ruthless Albanian gang that silently took over towns across England, using fear, manipulation, and a deadly network known as County Lines. They turned ordinary streets into their empire of crime, leaving a trail of terror that no one saw coming. In the quiet streets of a small English town, life carried on at its usual slow pace. Families strolled along pavements, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and children played in the parks, unaware that change was coming. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. New faces appeared, young men who didn't belong to any local community, moving quickly, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. At first, their presence went unnoticed. They were just strangers passing through, easily dismissed as tourists or seasonal workers. Yet beneath their calm exterior, they were observing, learning, and calculating, planting the seeds of something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Local residents started to notice small disruptions. Reports of petty thefts rose, and a few teenagers were suddenly missing for hours at a time, their parents' concern growing with every unanswered call. Shop owners mentioned unexplained break-ins or missing goods, yet there was no clear pattern. It was as if an invisible force had slipped into the town, unseen yet entirely present. Police began receiving reports, but the small department was overwhelmed. Officers chalked it up to ordinary crime spikes, unaware that these minor incidents were only the first layer of a much larger operation. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the gang was methodically establishing its presence. The young men were part of an organized Albanian network, with experience in county lines operations, an intricate system designed to move drugs from big cities into smaller towns, using vulnerable youths as couriers. The gang worked with precision, scouting locations, mapping out routes, and identifying potential recruits. They avoided drawing attention, never staying in one place too long. Everything they did was calculated to maintain secrecy, while gradually expanding influence. By the time the first visible signs of the gang's activity emerged, it was already too late for the town to be unaware. Teenagers began disappearing, not in numbers that would immediately alarm authorities, but enough to start whispers among parents and school staff. Some returned with pockets full of cash, claiming to have taken odd jobs, while others vanished entirely, their absence casting shadows of fear over entire neighborhoods. The gang's strategy relied on this mix of temptation and terror, pulling some into their network willingly, while forcing others into compliance through intimidation. The town's sense of safety, once taken for granted, began to erode. Streets that had been lively in the evenings grew quieter as parents kept their children home. Shopkeepers installed security cameras and reinforced doors, but no physical barrier could keep the gang's influence at bay. Their reach was not merely about controlling space, it was psychological. The residents didn't yet know the full scale of the operation, but an unspoken tension began to grip the town, a feeling that something sinister was quietly taking root. No one could predict the scale of what was coming next. The Albanian gang, organized, ruthless, and methodical, was preparing to turn the town into a central hub for their county lines operation. Every move they made was part of a larger plan that would unfold over months, even years. And for the people who lived there, life as they knew it was about to change forever. In those quiet streets, under the ordinary bustle of daily life, the shadows of danger were already stretching long and dark. The gang's influence became impossible to ignore as the county lines operation began to take hold. At first the signs were subtle. Teenagers appearing with expensive clothes or gadgets that seemed out of place for their families, strangers loitering near parks and schools, and the faint but growing smell of drugs in the air. The town, still adjusting to the sudden presence of outsiders, did not yet fully understand what was happening. Behind the scenes, the Albanian gang was orchestrating a system so intricate that it could move large quantities of drugs from the city into the surrounding counties with frightening efficiency. It was not merely about selling narcotics, it was about control, fear, and establishing a network that could dominate the town without ever being fully seen. The gang's method relied on teenagers, often lonely or vulnerable, who could be easily manipulated. They were taught to carry packages, exchange money, and deliver drugs while keeping their identities hidden. Some were drawn in by the promise of easy money, others were threatened into compliance, realizing that refusal could mean serious harm. The gang maintained a cold, calculated approach. Each teenager was monitored through encrypted phones, GPS tracking, and a network of older gang members who ensured the operation ran like a well-oiled machine. It was a system designed to be both invisible to the authorities and devastatingly effective in spreading their influence. As the operation grew, the streets began to change. Areas that were once familiar now felt different. People moved cautiously, always aware of who might be watching. Small-time dealers who had once operated openly found themselves facing intimidation, beatings, or sudden disappearances. The gang's presence was no longer a quiet threat, it was a visible, brutal reality. Residents whispered about young people they had once known, now appearing different, sullen, secretive, and often absent for hours at a time. The community was starting to realize that what was happening was more than petty crime. Something far darker had taken root, and it was spreading quickly. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. The gang's tactics were sophisticated. They used multiple mobile numbers, frequently changed locations, and maintained layers of communication that were nearly impossible to penetrate. Investigators found themselves chasing leads that vanished before they could be verified. Meanwhile, the gang's leadership remained invisible, communicating only through trusted intermediaries. The teenagers acted as both couriers and shields, carrying out the operation while shielding the adults who orchestrated everything. To the authorities, it was like trying to catch shadows. The impact on the local community was profound. Parents grew fearful, schools began noticing strange behavior, and ordinary citizens became hesitant to walk alone at night. The psychological effect of the gang's presence was as significant as the actual crimes. Even without fully understanding it, the town was being manipulated and controlled, its streets slowly falling under the gang's unspoken rule. It was a silent takeover, executed with precision and calculated cruelty. By the time the first serious confrontations occurred, teenagers arrested for drug possession, local dealers assaulted, and warnings left in public spaces, the gang's influence was already entrenched. The county lines were no longer a theory, they were a dangerous, operating reality. What had started as subtle infiltration had evolved into a powerful, ruthless system that dominated every corner of the town. And as the authorities began to uncover the first threads of this network, it became clear that dismantling it would be far more difficult than anyone had imagined. The town was now living under the shadow of a network that operated with precision, secrecy, and relentless control, and the worst was yet to come. The gang's expansion depended entirely on its ability to recruit teenagers, and they did it with a calculated mix of temptation and intimidation. They did not rely on brute force alone, instead they identified the vulnerable, the isolated, and the restless teenagers who felt invisible in their own lives, who longed for money, attention, or a sense of power. It started with small gestures, a few notes of kindness, offers of rides, or invitations to hang out in places the teens felt they belonged. Slowly, trust was built, and with it, the subtle manipulation that would turn ordinary children into unwilling participants in a criminal empire. The teenagers did not initially see themselves as criminals. They were couriers, messengers, and helpers, performing what seemed like small, manageable tasks. They carried packages, made deliveries, and collected money, always under strict instructions, never to reveal the contents or ask questions. To them it was exciting, a break from boredom, a chance to feel important. Some were impressed by the older gang members' confidence, their apparent wealth, and the mysterious aura that surrounded them. What they did not realize was that every small task brought them deeper into a dangerous web, one from which escape became increasingly difficult with each passing day. The gang's methods were ruthless when needed. Those who hesitated or expressed doubt were reminded of the consequences. Some received frightening threats, others were shown examples of what happened to those who refused. The lessons were clear: compliance ensured survival, defiance could lead to disappearance. Fear and loyalty became intertwined, creating a psychological grip that was almost impossible to break. The teenagers were trapped in a delicate balance between desire and terror, unsure how to navigate a world where every decision could have life or death consequences. Schools and parents struggled to comprehend the sudden changes in their children. Teenagers who once seemed ordinary began missing classes, withdrawing from family life, or suddenly coming into money with no explanation. Many parents chalked it up to teenage rebellion, unaware of the sophisticated grooming and coercion that had taken place. The gang maintained a tight control over communication, using encrypted messaging apps to manage their couriers, ensuring that any attempt to reach out for help was difficult, often impossible. Even law enforcement faced challenges. The teenagers were both victims and perpetrators, making the situation complex and emotionally charged. The gang also created a hierarchy among the young recruits. Older teenagers were given more responsibility, instructed to oversee younger recruits, and subtly indoctrinated with the gang's values: loyalty above all, fear as a tool, and secrecy as a necessity. The young people became both soldiers and enforcers, perpetuating the operation and ensuring its survival. This system created a cycle where the teens reinforced the gang's authority while losing their own innocence. The boundary between coercion and choice blurred, leaving them trapped in a world that demanded complicity while offering little freedom. By the time the town began to notice, it was already too late. The gang had transformed ordinary streets and homes into a network of control. Teenagers once thought of as harmless were now integral to the operation, their actions feeding a criminal empire that stretched far beyond the local area. Families, schools, and law enforcement realized that what had seemed like isolated incidents was part of a calculated, systematic effort to dominate the town. The Albanian gang's ability to manipulate the young, to turn innocence into obedience, had laid the foundation for a criminal network that was not only powerful but frighteningly resilient. The shadows they cast over the community were long, and escaping them would take courage, insight, and a willingness to confront a truth that many were only beginning to grasp. The first violent incident that shocked the town did not happen gradually. It arrived suddenly, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. A local dealer, one who had previously resisted the growing influence of the gang, was discovered badly beaten in an abandoned alleyway on the outskirts of town. The attack was brutal and unrelenting, a clear message that defiance would not be tolerated. Word of the assault spread quickly, creating an atmosphere of fear that gripped not only other dealers but anyone who might consider opposing the gang. For the first time, the reality of the operation's violence could no longer be ignored. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the scene was carefully staged. Evidence had been moved or destroyed, and witnesses were either too scared to speak or had disappeared. Investigators realized immediately that this was not a simple act of street violence. It was a calculated display of power. The gang wanted the town to understand that their reach was absolute and that they were willing to enforce it through brutality. Every corner of the community felt the tension, even those who were only peripherally aware of what was happening. Teenagers who had been recruited as couriers now witnessed the consequences of defiance firsthand. Some had previously toyed with the idea of leaving the operation or reporting it, but the attack on the dealer served as a chilling warning. Fear replaced hesitation, and compliance became the safest path. Even parents began to notice changes in their children. The once playful teenagers became withdrawn, anxious, and secretive. No one knew who was involved or who could be trusted, and the line between victim and perpetrator blurred further. The gang's strategy of intimidation did not stop with physical violence. They employed psychological tactics as well, ensuring that fear would penetrate every level of the community. Graffiti appeared overnight on walls near schools, subtle but threatening messages that signaled the gang's presence. Cars were vandalized, and doors were marked in ways that only insiders could interpret. These small, deliberate acts created a sense of omnipresence, convincing residents that the gang was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Law enforcement struggled to respond, investigators faced the challenge of building cases against a network that was highly organized and invisible. The adults behind the operation remained in the shadows, while the young couriers served as buffers between the gang and the outside world. Attempts to track communications were met with encrypted devices, burner phones, and constant movement, making traditional policing tactics almost useless. It became clear that any confrontation with the gang carried risk, not only for officers but also for the community at large. Despite these challenges, the first cracks began to appear in the gang's armor. A few daring teenagers who had observed too much or were pushed too far began quietly cooperating with the authorities. Their information, although fragmented, revealed the scope of the operation and the extent of the gang's brutality. The town, once paralyzed by fear, began to glimpse the possibility of resistance. But even as hope flickered, the gang's violence remained a constant, terrifying reminder that control was maintained through terror, and that the consequences of misstep were severe and often permanent. The investigation into the gang revealed a level of organization that stunned law enforcement. The adults behind the operation were never seen in public, their presence only felt through the network of teenagers and young adults they controlled. They communicated through encrypted phones and apps that made messages nearly impossible to trace, and they frequently changed numbers to avoid detection. Observing them from the outside, it seemed as though the gang existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Their structure was sophisticated, resembling a corporate hierarchy more than a criminal enterprise. Leaders gave orders, lieutenants managed logistics, and couriers, mostly teenagers, carried out operations while remaining disposable shields. Detectives discovered that the gang's network extended far beyond the county. Routes were mapped from major cities to remote towns, each one meticulously planned to ensure speed, secrecy, and maximum profit. Safe houses were scattered across the region, some abandoned buildings, others rented under false identities. These locations were used to store drugs, stash money, and temporarily house couriers. Even when authorities thought they had located a stash, it was often empty, a decoy designed to mislead and frustrate them. The gang's adaptability made them almost impossible to predict, and investigators realized that every raid needed careful planning to avoid tipping off the network. The gang's leaders were Albanian nationals, men and women who had previously operated in larger cities and had experience in international trafficking. They brought knowledge of logistics, communication, and enforcement that transformed a simple county lines operation into a highly efficient criminal machine. Teenagers acted as both tools and camouflage, carrying out deliveries while obscuring the identities of those truly in charge. Each courier was monitored constantly, their locations tracked through GPS apps, and their communications scrutinized. The gang maintained a level of control that left little room for error, punishing mistakes swiftly and decisively. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the gang operated like a shadow empire. They used threats and rewards to maintain loyalty, ensuring that teenagers remained compliant. Those who resisted were removed from the network, often violently. Meanwhile, those who excelled in their tasks were given small privileges and material rewards, creating a perverse system of incentives that bound them closer to the operation. It was a cycle of manipulation, fear, and temporary gratification that made escape increasingly difficult. Despite the gang's meticulous planning, cracks began to form in their system. A few teenagers who had grown disillusioned with their role started secretly sharing information with authorities. These insights revealed not only the location of stash houses, but also patterns in how the gang coordinated deliveries and payments. For the first time, detectives had a glimpse of the network's full scale, the number of couriers, the quantity of drugs being moved, and the intricate web of contacts stretching from urban centers to the smallest towns. Yet even with this knowledge, dismantling the network remained a challenge. The leaders were elusive, the couriers cautious, and the methods of communication nearly untraceable. Each discovery led to more questions about the gang's reach and power. The town had begun to understand that they were facing more than a local crime problem. They were dealing with a sophisticated international network that used fear, manipulation, and intelligence to maintain dominance. The shadow of the Albanian gang stretched across the county, and the authorities were only just beginning to understand the full extent of the danger they faced. The first major breakthrough came when a teenager who had been deeply involved in the operation decided to escape. Fear and guilt had finally outweighed the promises and threats the gang had used to control him. He left behind messages, notes, and evidence that revealed routes, stash houses, and key members of the operation. Law enforcement moved quickly, coordinating raids and arrests in a bid to disrupt the network before the gang could adapt. It was the first real chance the authorities had to strike a blow against the carefully orchestrated empire that had dominated the town for months. The raids were dramatic and tense. Officers entered abandoned buildings, rented flats and hidden rooms, discovering drugs stored in neat packages, piles of cash, and phones containing encrypted communication logs. The scale of the operation shocked everyone involved. Hundreds of kilograms of heroin and cocaine had passed through the county, and the financial profits were staggering. It became clear that the gang had not only controlled the streets, but also manipulated a vulnerable population of teenagers to maintain their empire. These young couriers, once seen as willing participants, were victims of manipulation, trapped in a dangerous cycle of coercion and fear. However, the gang had anticipated some level of exposure. Many key members had already disappeared, moving quickly to avoid arrest. They used safe houses in surrounding towns, frequently changed vehicles, and communicated only through newly acquired encrypted devices. Even as law enforcement celebrated the discovery of stash houses and evidence, it became painfully obvious that dismantling the network entirely would be far more difficult than anticipated. The gang's leaders remained elusive, invisible figures directing operations from afar, leaving the couriers to take the fall if the authorities closed in. The aftermath of the raids was a mix of relief and fear. Teenagers who had cooperated with authorities were placed under protection, but the psychological scars were profound. Many had witnessed or participated in acts they would later regret, and the threat of retribution from the gang loomed over them constantly. Families struggled to reconcile their shock with the realization that their children had been deeply entangled in criminal activities, manipulated by adults who had no regard for their well-being. The community itself felt a strange mix of pride and vulnerability, seeing law enforcement take action but understanding that the gang had already left a mark that would not be erased easily. Even with the raids, the gang adapted quickly. New couriers were recruited, old routes replaced with new ones, and safe houses shifted as needed. The network was resilient, built to survive disruptions. The arrests and seizures, while significant, only temporarily slowed the operation. Detectives realized that a complete dismantling would require months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and protection for witnesses willing to come forward. The fight against the network was just beginning, and the full extent of its influence was still emerging. Despite these challenges, the raids marked a turning point. The authorities had concrete evidence, teenagers were coming forward, and a pathway to unraveling the network had opened. It was the first real sign that the gang's seemingly untouchable empire could be challenged. Yet, even as victories were celebrated, the town remained on edge. The Albanian gang, cunning and adaptable, was far from defeated, and the shadow of their control still stretched over the streets and schools where so many lives had been forever changed. Even after the raids and arrests, a chilling truth began to surface that shook the town to its core. Authorities discovered that some of the missing teenagers had not simply run away or joined the gang voluntarily, they had been killed. The bodies, hidden in abandoned buildings and neglected fields, revealed a side of the operation that was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. These killings were not random acts of violence, they were calculated, deliberate, and designed to enforce obedience and instill terror. The community, already struggling to come to terms with the gang's control, now faced a grim reality. Children had been exploited and discarded when they became inconvenient or defiant. The revelation sent shockwaves through families and schools. Parents who had been searching desperately for missing teenagers were confronted with evidence of cruelty beyond comprehension. The gang's tactics were ruthless. Those who resisted recruitment, failed to follow orders, or threatened to expose operations were eliminated without hesitation. The killings were a warning, a stark demonstration that fear was the ultimate tool for maintaining control. It became clear that the network had not only profited from drugs, but also relied on terror to sustain its power. Investigators pieced together the methods used by the gang to cover their tracks. Safe houses were meticulously cleaned after each use. Surveillance cameras were monitored and avoided, and couriers were instructed on what to do if law enforcement arrived. The adults at the top rarely engaged directly with the violence, instead using intermediaries to enforce their rules. Teenagers who were both witnesses and participants were trapped in a web of fear and loyalty, forced to comply with actions they could barely understand. The deeper authorities dug, the more horrifying patterns emerged, revealing a network that treated human life as expendable when necessary to protect their empire. The psychological impact on the town was immense. Schools implemented emergency counseling programs, as students and staff struggled with the knowledge that their peers had been targeted and, in some cases, killed. Streets that had once been safe now felt haunted, and residents moved with caution, aware that the gang's influence still lingered despite law enforcement intervention. Ordinary life had been permanently altered, trust eroded, and the innocence of the community had been shattered. For detectives, the discovery of the bodies marked both a breakthrough and a moral challenge. The evidence confirmed the worst suspects, providing insight into the gang's ruthlessness, but it also raised the stakes of the investigation. Witnesses had to be protected, and every action taken had to account for potential retaliation. The Albanian gang's reach was still extensive, and their methods of control were as much psychological as physical. Breaking the network required more than arrests. It demanded courage, strategy, and unwavering commitment from law enforcement. Despite the horror, the revelations motivated authorities to press on. The discovery of hidden killings exposed the vulnerability of the gang and demonstrated that even the most fearsome operations could be challenged. It was a grim reminder that the network's power came from secrecy and intimidation, and once those were disrupted, the gang's grip could be weakened. The town, scarred but determined, began to rebuild, knowing that vigilance and resilience were now essential to protect its children and restore a sense of safety. The gang's influence, though still present, began to show signs of weakening, as the town and law enforcement adjusted to the harsh reality of the county lines operation. The raids, arrests, and cooperation of courageous teenagers had disrupted much of the network, and the community, once paralyzed by fear, slowly started to regain control over its streets. Families worked tirelessly to reclaim their homes, and schools implemented programs to educate students about the dangers of gang recruitment. For the first time in months, there was a sense of cautious hope that the town could heal from the damage inflicted by the Albanian gang. Community efforts became the backbone of this recovery. Parents, teachers, and local leaders banded together to create support networks for vulnerable teenagers. Workshops and counseling sessions were introduced, teaching children how to recognize manipulation and avoid falling prey to coercion. Social services increased monitoring in areas most affected by the gang's influence, while police officers patrolled neighborhoods with renewed focus on protection rather than mere enforcement. The combined effort of the town and authorities demonstrated that recovery was not simply a matter of arrests. It required rebuilding trust, safety, and awareness within the community itself. Despite progress, the psychological scars left by the gang's operations were profound. Teenagers who had been coerced into the network faced long-term trauma, grappling with guilt, fear, and mistrust. Families struggled to reconcile the reality that their children had been both victims and instruments of criminal activity. Even as daily life began to normalize, the memory of those who had disappeared or been killed remained a painful reminder of the cost of the gang's reign. The community realized that while streets could be reclaimed, the emotional and social consequences would linger for years. Law enforcement continued to pursue the remaining elements of the gang with diligence. While many leaders had vanished or gone underground, the intelligence gathered from earlier raids, as well as testimony from former couriers, provided a roadmap for dismantling the network completely. Officers focused on intercepting communications, monitoring safe houses, and protecting those who might testify. Slowly, the Albanian gang's ability to operate with impunity was reduced. Its networks of fear and secrecy began to unravel, and the power that had once seemed untouchable was being systematically eroded. The town's sense of resilience grew alongside the dismantling of the gang. Neighborhoods organized patrols and community meetings, fostering an environment of vigilance and cooperation. Schools and youth centers became hubs for education and social support, ensuring that children had alternatives to the lure of quick money and gang influence. For many residents, the experience had been a harsh lesson in the fragility of safety and the importance of awareness. It also became a story of determination, illustrating how collective action and courage could confront even the most ruthless criminal networks. By the time the gang's operations were largely contained, the town had been forever changed. The streets were quieter, the schools safer, and the children more protected. But the memory of those dark months lingered. The story of the Albanian gang that ran the county lines became a cautionary tale, a reminder that organized crime could infiltrate any community, exploit the vulnerable, and spread fear, but also that awareness, cooperation, and courage could eventually restore balance. The town, scarred yet determined, had survived, proving that even in the shadow of relentless danger, recovery and hope were possible.